At 37,000 feet, teenage passenger Marcus Chin pressed his call button during a crisis that would test everything his Air Force pilot mother had secretly taught him in hundreds of simulator hours, knowledge that skeptical adults refused to trust until 162 lives depended on it. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. The Boeing 737-800 aircraft carrying Flight 447 from Denver to Seattle sliced through the afternoon sky at 37,000 feet. Its twin engines humming with the steady, reassuring rhythm that experienced travelers have learned to ignore while reading their magazines or scrolling through downloaded movies on their personal devices. The flight, which had departed Denver International Airport approximately 43 minutes earlier, carried 162 souls on board, a number that included 3 flight attendants, 2 pilots, and 157 passengers of various ages, backgrounds, and destinations, all of them completely unaware that their lives were about to depend on the most unlikely person in the entire aircraft. 17-year-old Marcus Chen sat in seat 14A, the window seat on the left side of the aircraft, his backpack stuffed under the seat in front of him and his attention divided between the paperback novel resting on his tray table and the magnificent view of the Rocky Mountains passing below, their snow-covered peaks glinting in the brilliant sunlight that streamed through the small oval window. Marcus appeared entirely unremarkable to the businessman in 14B, who had barely glanced at the teenager before burying himself in spreadsheets on his laptop, and to the elderly woman in 14C, who had smiled politely at Marcus before closing her eyes for a nap that began almost immediately after the seatbelt sign had been turned off following their climb to cruising altitude. Marcus wore faded jeans, worn sneakers, and a Seattle Seahawks hoodie that had seen better days, and his shaggy black hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him look even younger than his 17 years, giving him the appearance of any other high school student traveling alone, perhaps visiting a divorced parent or heading to a college campus tour or simply taking advantage of cheap airline tickets during the off-season when airfare drops to prices that even teenagers saving money from part-time jobs at coffee shops and grocery stores can occasionally afford. What none of his fellow passengers could possibly have known, what Marcus had been trained since childhood never to advertise or discuss with strangers or even mention casually in conversations with friends at school, was that he had logged more than 300 hours in flight simulators, had studied aviation emergency procedures with an intensity that most adults never apply to their actual careers, and had absorbed every detail of cockpit resource management, emergency descent procedures, and aircraft systems operation from his mother, a United States Air Force pilot who had flown C-17 Globemaster III cargo aircraft in combat zones and training missions across 3 continents before retiring from active duty to take a position as a commercial airline captain. The flight attendants had completed their beverage service approximately 15 minutes earlier, and the cabin had settled into that peaceful, slightly drowsy atmosphere that characterizes the middle portion of domestic flights when passengers have finished their drinks and snacks, when the initial excitement of takeoff has faded into routine, and when the anticipation of landing and arrival still seems comfortably distant and not yet worthy of attention or preparation. Marcus had accepted a ginger ale from the flight attendant, a cheerful woman in her mid-40s named Sandra who wore her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and who had smiled at Marcus with the practiced warmth that airline crew members develop after thousands of passenger interactions, seeing him as just another young traveler, perhaps slightly more polite than average when he had thanked her for the beverage, but otherwise entirely forgettable among the sea of faces that passed through her workday. The voice that suddenly crackled through the aircraft's public address system carried a tremor that immediately silenced conversations throughout the cabin and caused passengers who had been dozing to jerk awake with the instant alertness that comes from recognizing, on some primal level, that something has gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Rebecca Walsh speaking from the flight deck," the voice said, and experienced travelers immediately recognized that something was deeply abnormal about a first officer making announcements, because that job almost always belonged to the captain, the pilot in command, the experienced aviator who sat in the left seat and who bore ultimate responsibility for the aircraft and everyone aboard. "We are experiencing a medical emergency with our captain, and I need to ask if there are any pilots or individuals with aviation experience on board this aircraft. If you have any flight training whatsoever, please press your call button immediately or identify yourself to a flight attendant." The cabin erupted into chaos that began as shocked silence and then transformed into frightened whispers that quickly escalated into full-voiced panic as passengers processed what they had just heard and began to understand the implications of a pilot in command becoming incapacitated during flight, leaving only the first officer to handle an aircraft carrying more than 160 people through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour while potentially thousands of feet above the Nearest airport or suitable landing site. A woman 3 rows ahead of Marcus began crying, her sobs loud and uncontrolled, while a man across the aisle started frantically typing on his phone despite the aircraft being in flight mode, perhaps trying to send final messages to loved ones or perhaps simply needing to do something, anything, to feel less helpless in the face of circumstances entirely beyond his control or comprehension. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate, felt the familiar physiological response that his mother had taught him to recognize and control, the adrenaline dump that sharpens senses and quickens reflexes but that can also cloud judgment if not properly managed through breathing techniques and mental discipline. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, drawing in a deep breath through his nose and exhaling slowly through his mouth, the 4-count breathing pattern that his mother had drilled into him during countless training sessions in the full-motion flight simulator that her airline maintained at their training facility, where she had brought Marcus during school vacations and summer breaks, where she had taught him everything she knew about flying, about emergency procedures, about staying calm when every instinct screamed for panic. Sandra, the flight attendant who had served Marcus his ginger ale, hurried down the aisle with her face pale and her professional composure visibly cracking around the edges, her eyes scanning the passengers with desperate hope that someone, anyone, would reveal themselves as qualified to help with the crisis unfolding in the cockpit. Marcus reached up and pressed his call button, the soft chime barely audible over the rising panic in the cabin, and when Sandra reached his row, Marcus looked directly into her eyes and spoke in a voice that he deliberately kept calm and level, a voice that his mother had taught him to use in emergencies, a voice that conveyed competence and confidence without arrogance or bravado. "I have extensive flight training," Marcus said, and Sandra's expression immediately shifted from desperate hope to visible skepticism as she looked at this teenager in his faded jeans and worn hoodie, this high school kid who couldn't possibly be what the first officer desperately needed in the cockpit. "My mother is Captain Jennifer Chen with United Airlines. She's been training me in full-motion simulators for the past 6 years, and I've logged over 300 hours practicing emergency procedures in 737 aircraft specifically." "You're 17 years old," Sandra said, her voice carrying both disbelief and a trace of something that might have been anger at what she perceived as a teenage prank during the worst possible moment, during a genuine emergency when lives hung in the balance and when false hope could be more cruel than no hope at all. 17 and 4 months, Marcus replied, still maintaining that calm, level tone that seemed almost incongruous coming from someone so young. "I've trained on 737 to 800 systems including this exact aircraft configuration. I know the emergency descent procedures, I understand cockpit resource management protocols, and I can help your first officer run checklists and manage aircraft systems while she focuses on flying. I'm not saying I can land this plane, but I can absolutely serve as an effective crew resource management assistant, and right now, that might be the difference between a successful emergency landing and a disaster." Sandra made a decision in that moment that would later be analyzed by aviation safety investigators, discussed by airline training departments, and debated by regulatory authorities. She chose to believe this impossibly young passenger, chose to trust that his calm demeanor and specific technical language indicated genuine knowledge rather than teenage bravado or dangerous overconfidence. She led Marcus toward the front of the aircraft, past passengers who watched with expressions ranging from confusion to horror as they saw a teenage boy heading toward the flight deck during an emergency, past the elderly woman who had been sitting in 14C and who grabbed Sandra's sleeve and asked in a trembling voice whether they were all going to die, past the businessman from 14B who looked up from his laptop with dawning comprehension and fear written across his features. The cockpit door, which under normal circumstances remained locked and secured against potential threats, stood open, and Marcus could see First Officer Rebecca Walsh in the right seat, her hands moving across the control panel with practiced efficiency but her face showing the strain of someone managing multiple critical tasks simultaneously while dealing with the knowledge that her captain, her experienced partner who had thousands more flight hours and decades more experience, lay unconscious in the jump seat behind the cockpit, his breathing shallow and his color gray in a way that suggested cardiac arrest or stroke or some other catastrophic medical event that had transformed him from a competent aviator into a patient requiring immediate emergency medical care that wouldn't be available until they landed. Marcus stepped into the cockpit and Rebecca Walsh turned to look at him, her expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, desperation, and finally a kind of grim acceptance as she processed that this teenager might be her only option for assistance. "Tell me your exact qualifications," she demanded, her voice sharp with stress and the particular kind of fear that comes from being solely responsible for more than 160 lives while simultaneously managing an aircraft emergency and dealing with the medical crisis of an incapacitated crew member. Marcus Chen, 17 years old, "I'm the son of Captain Jennifer Chen who flies for United," Marcus said, his voice still maintaining that careful calm that he had practiced in hundreds of simulator sessions. "I've logged 314 hours in full-motion 737 simulators under my mother's instruction. I've trained on normal and emergency procedures, I know the aircraft systems, and I understand that I'm here to assist you, not to fly the aircraft. Your pilot flying, I'm here to run checklists, manage communications, monitor instruments, and serve as your crew resource management partner so you can focus on aviation without dividing your attention across multiple tasks." Rebecca made her own split-second decision, recognizing that even if this teenager had only half the knowledge he claimed, even if he could only read checklists and monitor basic instruments, that assistance would be invaluable given her current situation of flying solo while her captain received emergency first aid from the flight attendants in the cabin behind the cockpit bulkhead. "Sit in the captain's seat," she ordered, and Marcus moved quickly but carefully, settling into the left seat and immediately beginning the instrument scan that his mother had taught him. Airspeed, altitude, heading, engine parameters, fuel quantity, moving his eyes in a systematic pattern across the primary flight display and the engine indicating and crew alerting system. Primary flight display shows us at flight level 370, airspeed 285 knots, heading 315, Marcus reported, falling automatically into the crew resource management communication pattern that his mother had drilled into him. Engine parameters normal, fuel showing 4.2 thousand pounds remaining, no caution or warning lights on the ICAS panel. Rebecca stared at him for a moment, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. This kid knew the terminology, knew the scan pattern, knew how to read the instruments and report the information in standard format. "We need to divert to the nearest suitable airport," Rebecca said, her hands already moving across the flight management computer. "Captain went down approximately 4 minutes ago, we're currently over central Wyoming, and I'm calculating that Casper-Natrona County International is our best option at approximately 70 nautical miles southeast of our current position. Casper has a 7,000-foot runway, should be adequate for our landing weight," Marcus said, and he saw Rebecca's eyebrows rise slightly at his immediate knowledge of airport specifications. "Do you want me to run the emergency descent checklist while you coordinate with ATC for the diversion?" Rebecca nodded, and Marcus reached for the quick reference handbook mounted beside the captain's seat, flipping to the emergency descent section with fingers that remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, despite the knowledge that he was sitting in the captain's seat of a commercial airliner during an actual emergency, not a simulator session where mistakes could be reset with the push of a button. "Center, Flight 447 declaring an emergency," Rebecca transmitted over the radio, her voice professional despite the circumstances. "We have an incapacitated captain and require immediate diversion to the nearest suitable airport." The air traffic controller's response came back immediately, his tone shifting from routine to focused urgency. "Flight 447, roger, emergency declared, advise souls on board and fuel remaining." "Flight 447, 162 souls on board, 4.2 thousand pounds fuel remaining," Rebecca replied, and Marcus felt the weight of those numbers, the 162 people whose lives depended on the decisions being made in this cockpit during the next critical minutes and hours. "Flight 447, cleared direct Casper, descend and maintain flight level 250, I'm coordinating emergency equipment and clearing the airspace," the controller transmitted, and Marcus could hear the barely controlled tension in his voice, could imagine the controller alerting supervisors, notifying emergency responders, clearing other aircraft from the flight path, managing the dozens of tasks that accompanied an in-flight emergency. Marcus began reading from the emergency descent checklist, his voice clear and steady as Rebecca performed each item. "Announcement to cabin," Marcus read, and Rebecca keyed the public address system, informing passengers that they were diverting to Casper due to the medical emergency and that everyone should remain seated with seatbelts fastened. "Transponder set to 7700, Marcus continued, and Rebecca's hand moved to the transponder panel, dialing in the emergency squawk code that would cause Flight 447 to light up on every air traffic control radar scope within range, alerting every controller and every nearby aircraft that this flight was in distress. "Descent rate," Marcus read from the checklist, and Rebecca pulled the speed brake lever, extending the panels on the wings that would allow the aircraft to descend more rapidly without exceeding safe airspeeds, and Marcus watched the vertical speed indicator begin showing a descent rate of 3,000 feet per minute, the aircraft angling downward in a controlled emergency descent that would bring them from their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet down to a more manageable altitude where emergency landing preparations could begin. The cabin behind them had descended into near chaos, with passengers crying and praying and holding hands with strangers, with people calling out to God or to deceased relatives or simply crying in fear, but Marcus forced himself to block out those sounds, forced himself to focus entirely on the instruments before him and the checklist items that Rebecca needed him to manage. Engine anti-ice, Marcus read, checking the outside air temperature and noting that they were descending through altitudes where ice formation on the engine inlets could become a concern. Recommend on given current temperature. Rebecca's hand moved to the engine anti-ice switches without hesitation, and Marcus felt a surge of something that wasn't quite pride but rather a kind of grim satisfaction at being able to provide useful, necessary assistance during this crisis. His mother had been right. All those hours in the simulator, all those training sessions that had sometimes felt tedious or excessive, all that preparation that his friends at school had thought was weird or nerdy or obsessive, all of it was now proving its value in this moment when lives depended on his ability to function as an effective crew member. Flight 447, Casper Tower has been notified, emergency equipment will be standing by, runway 21 in use, weather showing wind 200 at 8 knots, visibility 10 miles, ceiling broken at 6,000 feet. The controller transmitted, providing the critical information that Rebecca would need for planning the approach and landing. Marcus pulled up the airport information on the electronic flight bag, studying the approach plates for Casper's runway 21, noting the published approach minimums and the terrain surrounding the airport. Approach minimums for the ILS runway 21 are 200 feet and half-mile visibility, Marcus reported, anticipating the information Rebecca would need. We're currently showing weather well above minimums. Sandra appeared at the cockpit door, her face streaked with tears that she had been trying to hide from the passengers. Captain Reeves is still unconscious, she reported, her voice barely above a whisper. We're doing CPR, but... She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the sentence, and Marcus understood that the captain's condition was critical, that the medical emergency was far from over even as they managed the aviation emergency. Keep working on him, Rebecca said firmly. We're approximately 20 minutes from landing in Casper, and there will be paramedics waiting. She glanced at Marcus and he could see the complex mix of emotions on her face, gratitude for his assistance, lingering doubt about his abilities, fear about the landing that still lay ahead, and underneath it all, a kind of desperate hope that maybe, somehow, they would all survive this day. Marcus continued monitoring the instruments, calling out altitude as they descended through each 1,000-foot increment, watching the fuel quantity decrease with each passing minute, tracking their progress toward Casper on the navigation display. Passing through flight level 270, he reported. Fuel showing 3.9 thousand pounds, engines normal, pressurization normal, all systems green. A male voice suddenly spoke from the cabin behind them, loud and aggressive. What the hell is a kid doing in the cockpit? The voice belonged to a passenger who had apparently left his seat despite instructions to remain seated and belted, who had made his way forward to the flight deck and who now stood in the cockpit doorway with an expression of outrage and disbelief on his face. You're letting a teenager help fly the plane? Are you insane? Rebecca turned to face him, and Marcus saw steel in her expression that reminded him of his mother's command presence. Sir, return to your seat immediately, she ordered. This young man has extensive training and is providing critical assistance during this emergency. He's a child, the man shouted, his fear manifesting as anger and disbelief. How can you possibly trust a kid with our lives? Marcus kept his attention on the instruments, refusing to be distracted by the confrontation, continuing his scan pattern and his monitoring duties even as the argument continued behind him. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to return to your seat, Rebecca said, her voice dropping into a lower register that somehow carried more authority than her previous tone. Or I will have the flight attendants physically restrain you for interfering with flight operations during an emergency. Sandra stepped forward and took the man's arm, firmly guiding him away from the cockpit despite his protests, and as she led him back toward the cabin, Marcus heard him still shouting about lawsuits and negligence and how they were all going to die because a kid was pretending to be a pilot. Marcus took a deep breath, using his mother's calming technique again, refusing to let the man's words shake his confidence or his focus. Thank you for staying focused, Rebecca said quietly, and Marcus nodded without taking his eyes off the instruments. Passing through 25,000, Marcus reported, continuing with the essential crew duties. Casper altimeter 2987, field elevation 5350 feet. As they descended through 20,000 feet, Rebecca began configuring the aircraft for landing, calling for flaps and landing gear, and Marcus responded to each request, monitoring the systems as the aircraft's configuration changed from high-speed cruise to landing approach. The landing gear extended with a solid thunk that reverberated through the airframe, and Marcus watched the landing gear indicators change from red to green as the main gear and nose gear locked into position, checking the hydraulic pressure gauges to ensure that all three gear assemblies had received adequate pressure for safe extension and locking. Flight 447, you are 10 miles from the outer marker, cleared ILS runway 21 approach, tower frequency 118.6. The approach controller transmitted, and Rebecca acknowledged the clearance while Marcus tuned the tower frequency into the standby position on the radio panel, ready to flip to tower when Rebecca needed to communicate with the airport control tower for landing clearance. Marcus could see Casper appearing ahead of them through the cockpit windscreen, the city's lights beginning to glow in the early evening darkness, the airport beacon rotating green and white in the standard pattern that marked the location of controlled airports, and he felt his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation because this was it. This was the moment when all their preparation and training would be tested by the reality of bringing this aircraft safely back to the ground with more than 160 people depending on their competence and skill. 5 miles from outer marker, speed on profile, descent rate 700 feet per minute, Marcus reported, reading the instruments and providing Rebecca with the critical information she needed to assess whether the approach was stable and safe or whether they needed to execute a go-around and make another attempt at landing. Localizer and glide slope captured. Autopilot engaged, aircraft is tracking the approach course. Rebecca's hands hovered near the controls, ready to take over manual flying if the autopilot deviated from the approach path, but the system was performing flawlessly, tracking the electronic signals that defined the optimal descent path to runway 21's threshold. Landing checklist, Rebecca requested, and Marcus pulled out the plastic-coated checklist card, beginning to read the items that would ensure the aircraft was properly configured for landing. Landing gear down, 3 green, Marcus read and Rebecca confirmed the gear indication. Flaps 30, green light, Marcus continued and Rebecca verified the flap position. Speed brakes armed, Marcus read, checking the speed brake lever position that would cause the spoilers to deploy automatically upon touchdown, reducing lift and improving braking effectiveness. Flight 447, tower, winds 210 at 7 knots, runway 21, cleared to land, emergency equipment standing by. The tower controller transmitted, and Marcus could hear the tension in the controller's voice, could imagine the emergency vehicles positioned alongside the runway, the paramedics and firefighters waiting with equipment ready, preparing for whatever condition they would find when Flight 447 touched down. At 500 feet above the ground, the aircraft's ground proximity warning system called out 500, and Marcus felt his hands grip the sides of his seat as Rebecca disconnected the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft for the final seconds of the approach, her hands on the control yoke and her feet on the rudder pedals, making tiny corrections to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline as they descended through the darkening sky toward the illuminated runway that represented safety and survival and the end of their emergency. 50, 40, 30, 20, the radio altimeter called out, announcing the height above the runway, and Rebecca pulled back slightly on the control yoke, beginning the flare that would reduce the descent rate and allow the aircraft to touch down gently on the main landing gear. Marcus held his breath, watching the runway rise up to meet them, and then he felt the slight bump as the main wheels contacted the pavement, followed immediately by the nose gear settling onto the runway, and Rebecca deployed the thrust reversers while simultaneously applying the brakes, slowing the aircraft from its landing speed down to taxiing speed while Marcus silently counted down the remaining runway, ensuring they had adequate distance to stop safely without running off the end of the pavement. The aircraft rolled to a stop approximately 3,000 feet down the runway, and Rebecca set the parking brake while Marcus began shutting down systems in preparation for evacuation. And through the cockpit windows, Marcus could see the emergency vehicles racing toward them, their red lights flashing in the darkness, their sirens barely audible over the sound of the aircraft's engines still running at idle power. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely in Casper," Rebecca announced over the public address system, and Marcus could hear cheering from the cabin behind them, could hear crying and laughing and the sounds of people embracing and calling out in relief and gratitude and the kind of overwhelming emotion that comes from surviving something that very easily could have ended in tragedy and disaster. "Please remain seated while emergency personnel approach the aircraft." Paramedics boarded the aircraft within seconds, rushing to where Captain Reeves lay unconscious in the rear of the cabin where the flight attendants had moved him to provide CPR and emergency medical care, and Marcus watched as they loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him off the aircraft with efficient speed, their faces grim and focused as they worked to save a life that hung in precarious balance. Sandra appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measures, and she looked at Marcus with an expression that combined wonder and disbelief and something that might have been respect. "You did it," she said simply, and Marcus shook his head. "First Officer Walsh did it," Marcus corrected. "I just assisted." Rebecca turned to look at him, and Marcus saw tears streaming down her face, tears that she had been holding back during the entire emergency, during all the critical minutes when she had needed to maintain her composure and focus and professional demeanor. "You saved our lives," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "Don't minimize what you did. You were an absolutely essential crew member, and I could not have done this without you." The passengers disembarked into the Casper Terminal building, where airline representatives and crisis counselors waited to provide assistance and support and to arrange continued travel or hotel accommodations for the unexpected overnight stay that would be necessary while investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began their preliminary examination of the circumstances surrounding Captain Reeves's medical emergency and the successful diversion and landing of Flight 447. Marcus followed the other passengers off the aircraft, suddenly feeling exhausted as the adrenaline that had sustained him during the emergency began to drain from his system, leaving him feeling shaky and uncertain and much more like the 17-year-old kid he actually was rather than the competent crew member he had managed to be during the critical moments in the cockpit. The man who had confronted Marcus in the cockpit approached him in the terminal, his earlier anger transformed into shame and gratitude, and he extended his hand toward Marcus with an expression that combined apology and wonder. "I'm sorry I doubted you," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, saved all our lives, and I was wrong to question your abilities." Marcus shook the man's hand, accepting the apology with a nod, and then he found himself surrounded by passengers who wanted to thank him, wanted to hug him, wanted to express their gratitude and their amazement that someone so young could have performed with such competence and calm during such a terrifying emergency. The elderly woman from seat 14C embraced him with tears streaming down her face, telling him that he was an angel sent by God to save them, and while Marcus didn't feel like an angel, felt instead like an exhausted teenager who desperately wanted to call his mother and hear her voice and tell her about what had just happened. He accepted the woman's gratitude with grace and humility. Rebecca emerged from a conversation with airline management and NTSB investigators, and she made her way directly to Marcus, taking both his hands in hers and looking into his eyes with an intensity that made Marcus understand the depth of what they had just been through together. "The investigators want to interview you," Rebecca said. "They're amazed by what happened today, and they want to understand your training and how you were able to serve so effectively as a crew member despite your age." Marcus spent the next 3 hours answering questions from NTSB investigators, from airline safety personnel, from FAA inspectors who had been dispatched to Casper to examine the circumstances of the emergency, and from local law enforcement who needed to document the incident for their own records and reports. He explained his training background, explained his mother's role in teaching him aviation procedures and emergency responses, explained the hundreds of hours he had spent in simulators learning systems and procedures and the calm, methodical approach to crisis management that his mother had instilled in him through repetition and practice and the kind of patient instruction that only a loving parent could provide. By the next morning, Marcus's name and face were appearing on national news broadcasts, with headlines describing the teenage hero who had helped save Flight 447. With aviation experts being interviewed about the unprecedented nature of a 17-year-old serving as an effective crew member during a commercial airline emergency, with debates about whether airlines should implement new programs to identify and train young people with aviation interest and aptitude. Marcus's phone, which had been off during the flight and during the immediate aftermath, now buzzed continuously with messages from friends and teachers and distant relatives who had seen the news coverage and wanted to express their amazement and pride and curiosity about what had really happened at 37,000 feet when Captain Reeves had collapsed and First Officer Walsh had found herself flying alone until an unlikely helper had pressed his call button and offered assistance. Captain Jennifer Chin, Marcus's mother, flew to Casper on the first available flight the next morning, and when Marcus saw her emerging from the jetway at the Casper terminal, he felt emotions that he had been suppressing since the emergency finally break through his carefully maintained composure, and he found himself crying as his mother embraced him, her own tears mixing with his as they stood in the middle of the terminal holding each other while passengers and airport staff walked around. Them and television cameras captured the reunion for evening news broadcasts that would show the moment when a mother and son connected after an experience that had tested everything she had taught him and everything he had learned. "I'm so proud of you," Jennifer whispered into Marcus's ear, her voice breaking with emotion. "You did exactly what I taught you to do. You stayed calm, you used your training, you served as an effective crew member, and you helped save lives." "I was scared," Marcus admitted, speaking words that he hadn't been able to say to anyone else, words that he could only share with his mother, who would understand the complexity of what he had experienced. "I was terrified that I would make a mistake, that I would miss something important, that my help wouldn't be enough." "Being scared doesn't mean you weren't brave," Jennifer said, pulling back to look at her son's face. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite the fear, and you showed more courage yesterday than most people show in their entire lives." Captain Reeves survived his cardiac arrest, spending a week in intensive care at a Casper hospital before being transferred to a cardiac center in Denver, where surgeons performed multiple bypass operations that would eventually restore him to reasonable health, though he would never fly commercially again and would instead retire to spend time with grandchildren and to volunteer teaching aviation to young people who might someday find themselves in the position that Marcus had occupied, needing knowledge and skills and the calm confidence that comes from proper training and preparation. Reeves sent Marcus a letter from his hospital bed, thanking him for helping to save the lives of everyone aboard Flight 447, thanking him for being prepared and willing to act when the emergency occurred, and telling Marcus that he represented everything that was right and good about the next generation of aviators who would someday replace the current generation of pilots who had devoted their lives to safely transporting passengers through the skies. Rebecca Walsh received commendations from her airline and from the FAA for her professional handling of the emergency, for her willingness to accept assistance from an unconventional source, and for her skill in landing the aircraft safely despite the overwhelming stress of flying alone with an incapacitated captain and more than 160 lives depending on her competence and judgment. She visited Marcus and Jennifer in Seattle 2 months after the emergency, bringing with her a flight bag that had belonged to Captain Reeves, which he had asked her to give to Marcus as a token of appreciation and respect, and the 3 aviators, 1 experienced first officer, 1 retired Air Force and commercial captain, and 1 17-year-old whose official logbook contained only simulator hours but whose practical experience now included serving as an effective crew member during an actual commercial airline emergency, spent an afternoon discussing the incident, analyzing what had worked well and what could have been improved, and talking about the future of aviation training and the ways that knowledge and skills could be transmitted across generations and age groups. The airline offered Marcus a position in their cadet program, guaranteeing him a pathway to becoming a commercial pilot once he completed the necessary flight training and accumulated the required hours and ratings and certificates. And while Marcus accepted the offer with gratitude and excitement, he also understood that the real gift his mother had given him wasn't the technical knowledge or the simulator time or the emergency procedure training, but rather the understanding that preparation creates opportunity, that skills learned and practiced can make the difference between disaster and survival, and that being ready to help when help is needed is perhaps the most valuable thing any person can offer to their fellow humans who share this fragile existence, as we all move through our days hoping that when crisis comes, someone nearby will have the knowledge and courage and willingness to step forward and do what needs to be done. Marcus returned to his high school in Seattle, where he was treated as a minor celebrity for approximately 2 weeks before the attention faded and he became once again just another senior completing his final year of high school and preparing for college and adulthood and all the normal concerns and excitement that come with being 17 years old and standing on the threshold between childhood and the adult life that waits beyond graduation. But something had changed inside Marcus, something subtle but profound, a kind of deep confidence that came from knowing that when he had been tested by genuine emergency, when lives had depended on his ability to perform under pressure, he had not failed, had not panicked, had not let fear prevent him from offering help when help was desperately needed. His mother continued taking him to the simulator on weekends and holidays, continuing his training not because she expected another emergency to occur. Lightning rarely strikes the same place twice, and the odds of Marcus finding himself in another situation where his unusual skills would be needed were astronomically small, but rather because both of them now understood at a visceral level that training and preparation are never wasted, that knowledge carefully transmitted from one generation to the next creates possibilities that cannot be predicted or planned, and that being ready to help when help is needed is not just a personal virtue but a contribution to the web of mutual support and assistance that allows human civilization to function and to endure through all the crises and emergencies and unexpected disasters that inevitably occur when millions of people move through the world in aircraft and vehicles and buildings and ships. All of us hoping that if something goes wrong, someone nearby will know what to do and will have the courage to do it. On the 1-year anniversary of Flight 447's emergency landing in Casper, Wyoming, Marcus stood at a podium in an aviation safety conference in Seattle, addressing an audience of pilots, flight attendants, airline executives, and FAA regulators who had gathered to discuss crew resource management and the lessons that could be learned from the incident that had captured national attention and that had prompted serious discussions about how aviation knowledge could be transmitted to young people who showed interest and aptitude for flying even before they were old enough to hold commercial pilot certificates or to serve as official crew members on commercial aircraft. Marcus spoke about his training with his mother, spoke about the importance of preparation and practice, spoke about the value of staying calm under pressure and of using systematic approaches to problem solving even when emotions run high and when fear threatens to overwhelm rational thought. After his presentation, a young girl approximately 12 years old approached Marcus during the reception, accompanied by her father who wore an airline captain's uniform and who looked at Marcus with an expression that combined respect and curiosity and perhaps a kind of hope that his own child might someday demonstrate the same competence and courage that Marcus had shown at 37,000 feet when Captain Reeves had collapsed and First Officer Walsh had needed help. The girl told Marcus that she wanted to be a pilot someday, that her father was teaching her about